the United States and China. And it will either be the story of an unfair and unbalanced relationship that led to the decline of a once great beacon of hope and liberty and prosperity, or it will be a story of a stable, balanced, and sustainable relationship that allowed us to further and protect our national interests and the common good of our people. Authoritarian communism have aimed to sabotage that defense of our system. So while it may be true that China is, quote, breaking the rules, or that Chinese companies are engaging in unfair competition against the American order, the fundamental challenge will not be simply solved by some future trade agreement. The fundamental challenge is that China seeks to prove that you can have a prosperous society, a contented citizenry, and be the world's major power. And you can have all these things without respecting human dignity and freedom, or even a belief in God.
与有社会主义计划经济历史背景的中国不同，尊重自由市场经济的美国一向都没有产业政策之说。但身为共和党人的鲁比奥却多次提出，为了抗衡中国，美国需要有自己的产业政策。他一方面认为美国政府应该扶植与国家安全有关的产业。他提到，美国二战后总是通过公司合作方式推进国家安全与利益，并以稀土为例说明市场在保护关键产业和国家利益方面的不足。作为参议院小企业委员会的主席，卢比奥还提出，应当通过改革鼓励小型企业在航空、铁路、电子、通信和农业机械产业进行投资。这些产业也是中国在其产业政策中国制造2025中优先扶持的产业。另一方面，他反对以市场为理由而损失掉美国的国家安全与利益。市场也许会说，可以为了短期利润遵从中国对美国公司提出的要求，美国人应当投资中国公司，但是政策制定者必须考虑的是，将生产长期交给中国是否是不顾后果的鲁莽行为。美国投资者是否应该投资那些窃取美国公司知识产权、侵犯人权、发展可能用于对付美国的武器的中国公司？卢比奥说，跨国公司为了追求利益，将曾经维系美国的体面的工作外包给中国，而美国的政策制定者曾经也鼓励这种行为。他说，我们醒来看到这样的现实，在美国沉睡之际，中国共产党已涌现成为我们的繁荣、自由和安全所面对的迫在眉睫而且不断扩大的威胁。
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Last month I spoke to students at Catholic University about the growing sense that our nation's institutions, especially in government, seem unable to identify a common good and to pursue it. And I outlined my view that poses a threat to our economic foundations and our ability to respond to threats abroad. Now, I started that speech using a 19th century papal encyclical as its launch point, a document written as industrialization was causing tremendous economic change and disruption, a time not unlike our own. And so this morning I'm honored to speak here at the National Defense University to discuss the defining geopolitical relationship of this century, the one between the United States and China. Now, unfortunately, I was unable to find a papal encyclical on this topic, and I searched, but I believe this is the perfect setting for this message, given the unique mission of NDU to prepare all of you and all of its graduates with the ability to develop strategies and to solve our nation's most difficult national security challenges. So let me begin by pointing out that for decades, we had in this country a pretty broad consensus that once China became rich, they would become more like us. They'd become more democratic, they'd become more respectful of the rules that govern international trade and commerce. But while China has become richer, it has only deepened its authoritarian grip domestically, as evidenced yesterday by an article about a book burning, or book burnings going on in China. Nothing like good old-fashioned book burnings to remind you of the true nature of a government. And they continue to flagrantly defy both international law that governs trade and commerce. The last several years have, in my view, brought a long overdue and frankly almost too late readjustment to our views on China. Almost overnight, we have awakened to the reality that while America slept, the Chinese Communist Party has emerged as an immediate and growing threat to prosperity, to our freedoms, to our security. Multinational corporations that are headquartered in our country have, in search of quick profits, outsourced the dignified jobs that once sustained Americans, and they've outsourced them to China. And our policymakers have rewarded this behavior. Now we see that once vibrant cities and towns are shells of their former selves, where incomes that once supported valuable industry, once supported by valuable industries, have been replaced by government checks and credit card debt. We see how tons of fentanyl that's manufactured in China flood our country, taking thousands of lives and destroying countless families. Now, while the experts were intoxicated with this post-Cold War fantasy about the end of history, and a bipartisan consensus formed that an American-helmed international order would forever be the new normal, and that the arc of all nations bends towards democracy and the respect for rule of law. Now, we've no doubt made great progress towards advancing our values and our interests, but it's now clear that that consensus about China was dangerously flawed. I begin by pointing out that the Chinese Communist Party and the government that it controls believes that it is its rightful place to be at the center of the world, and it views the last 100 years as an aberration that it intends to correct. They have no interest in adhering to the rules of a post-war international system that we helped create, and instead they seek to upend it and/or replace it. And they've pursued these plans while hiding their strength and biding their time, portraying themselves as a poor developing country and a non-expansionist power. And they succeeded in luring American policymakers into making negligent and catastrophic mistakes. Washington passed financial, trade, tax, and patent laws designed to smooth over the process for companies to open up operations in China. And in turn, China would force those American companies to partner with domestic competitors who would then steal their trade secrets and eventually become their competitors and put them out of business. Washington allowed China into what was supposed to be the trade union of free states, the World Trade Organization. Beijing has accepted all of the benefits, but none of the responsibilities that came with that membership. And under intense lobbying from companies desperate for access to the enormous Chinese market, Washington did little to call out or address the Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and 3 decades ago in Tiananmen Square. Meanwhile, Chinese leaders kept subsidizing their domestic industries while simultaneously undermining ours. They kept stealing intellectual property. They kept reverse engineering products. They kept expanding access to our markets for their companies while restricting access to their markets for ours. And they used the profits from these unfair practices to fund substantial investments in research and development of their own. And now, we awaken to the reality that for the first time in 3 decades, we are confronted with a near-peer rival that seeks to displace us militarily, economically, technologically, and geopolitically. Now, let me be clear, our aim should not be to halt China's rise. The task before us is to prevent America's fall. China is and will continue to be a great global power, but we must not continue to allow its progress to come at the expense of our country, of our citizens, of our values, and at the expense of the rules-based international order that emerged from the incredible sacrifices made by the generations before us, the generations that defeated Nazi Germany in World War II and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. This century will be defined by the relationship between the United States and China. And it will either be the story of an unfair and unbalanced relationship that led to the decline of a once great beacon of hope and liberty and prosperity, or it will be a story of a stable, balanced, and sustainable relationship that allowed us to further and protect our national interests and the common good of our people. And what is a balanced and sustainable relationship with China? Well, it's no longer ignoring China's repeated and flagrant violations of the international rule of law, violations of the assurances they made to the people of Hong Kong when their city was handed over, violations like the construction and militarization of artificial islands in the South China Sea after years of repeatedly promising the whole world that they would never do so. It's time to no longer ignore China's repeated and flagrant violations of human rights, forcing over 1 million Uyghur and other Muslims into labor camps in Xinjiang, the systematic oppression of all religions, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Falun Gong alike, and the crackdown on political dissent at home and freedom of expression everywhere, including even here in the United States. A balanced and sustainable relationship is rejecting Chinese colonial expansionism, which ensnares smaller countries in a state of permanent economic vassalage. The exploitation of political corruption to lay debt traps, bleeding countries dry, and then hijacking their domestic and economic infrastructure. And the use of associated firms like Huawei to entice foreign nations into exploitative contracts that give China access to foreign nations' critical national security data. But the most important element of a balanced relationship with China, the one that I want to focus the bulk of my comments on here today, is to address how China has used its material resources, like access to its vast consumer markets, massive labor force, and technological development of its companies, to further its national interest, and at the same time to undermine ours. It is a fact that when you are doing business with a Chinese company, you are ultimately doing business with the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing has used the foreign investment of American companies to steal intellectual property and technologies in order to build their own native capacities and destroy ours. A few years ago, they publicly outlined their plan to dominate 10 emerging industries in the 21st century. And this isn't just some tin-pot communist 5-year plan. It's a coherent strategy to become the world leader in industries such as aerospace, quantum computing, and industrial machinery. Let me read you a quote from one of the translations of the plan's introduction. Here's the quote. "Manufacturing is the main pillar of the national economy, the foundation of the country, tool of transformation and basis of prosperity. Since the beginning of industrial civilization in the middle of the 18th century, it has been proven repeatedly by the rise and fall of world powers that without strong manufacturing, there is no national prosperity." End quote. Again, that is a translation as part of the plan's introduction. It's also a serious and direct challenge for our nation, and one that we must respond to for 2 reasons. The first is because one of the most powerful defenses of our American system has long been the prosperity of our way of life. For generations, industrial jobs have made up the core of our middle class, enabling Americans to make a good living and give their time and treasure back to their families and to their communities. These are the families where stable, dignified work allowed children to do better than their parents, opened up a world of opportunities in education, in work, and in life for them. In many of our communities, local factories and other industrial centers provided the good, productive jobs, a source of pride to their communities and an envy to much of the rest of the world. And China and its authoritarian communism have aimed to sabotage that defense of our system. So while it may be true that China is, quote, breaking the rules, or that Chinese companies are engaging in unfair competition against the American order, the fundamental challenge will not be simply solved by some future trade agreement. The fundamental challenge is that China seeks to prove that you can have a prosperous society, a contented citizenry, and be the world's major power. And you can have all these things without respecting human dignity and freedom, or even a belief in God. The second reason we have to respond to the challenges before us is because the industries that China intends to dominate are the very ones that will create the dignified and productive work. The kind of dignified and productive work that Americans need for us to remain a strong nation. Now, responding to this challenge will require us to reject the fundamentalism that argues that the greatest virtue in American policy is to maximize economic efficiency. The market will always reach the most efficient economic outcome. The problem is that sometimes the most efficient economic outcome is at odds with the common good and the national interest. Outsourcing jobs to China might be more efficient. It lowers the labor costs and increases the profits. But the good jobs we lose end up destroying families and communities. Just last year, a study found that areas of the United States that faced Chinese import saturation from 1990 to the year 2014 experienced drops in male employment, as well as declining marriage and fertility rates. In communities that bore the brunt of what some call normalizing trade relations with China, we even see jumps in suicide rates and deaths from substance abuse. So for policymakers, the common good can't just be about corporate profits. It can't just be about finding economic efficiency. When dignified work, particularly for men, goes away, so too goes away the backbone of our culture. The evidence shows our communities become blighted and wither away, families collapse, and fewer people get married, and ultimately it ruptures the soul of our nation. This experience has become essentialized today in images of decaying Rust Belt towns and the epidemic of working class deaths of despair. But this story is playing out just as destructively in our nation's inner cities. From Flint to Phoenix, from Baltimore to Birmingham, the erosion of dignified work is colorblind and is geographically limitless. Now, to be clear, free enterprise is the greatest mechanism man has ever employed for achieving prosperity. But at the same time, we must always remember that the market is agnostic as to whether America is a high or a low-wage economy. The market is agnostic on whether a certain outcome is in our national interest or the common good. The market might be agnostic, but policymakers like me cannot be. And I suspect that many, if not all of you, men and women who are here because you are committed to our national security, are not agnostic either. For example, the market may say short-term profits justify adhering to the requirements that China places on our companies. But policymakers must take into account that long-term surrendering of our productive capacity to China is reckless. The market may say that Americans, often unwittingly, should invest in Chinese firms. But policymakers must take into account whether American investors should be capitalizing the very firms that steal from our companies, that commit human rights abuses, and develop the weapons that could one day kill the men and women of our military. This is not a call to socialism or a rejection of capitalism. It's a call to policymakers to remember that the national interest, not economic growth alone, is our central obligation. This isn't a call to recreate the economy of America's past. It's a call to invest and compete in the emerging industries of the future instead of forfeiting them to China. And this isn't a knee-jerk call to protectionism. It's a call to maintain the technological and industrial superiority necessary to defend our interests and ensure that working Americans have access to dignified and productive work. Now, the critics of the approach that I've just laid out argue that I'm making us choose industries to favor, that I'm arguing that we need to pick winners and losers. But the truth is, we are already doing that. The only difference is the path we are on now is allowing Beijing to do the picking and the choosing. How secure or prosperous can America be if it cannot carry out heavy industry or pharmaceutical manufacturing or advanced technology? American policymakers have an obligation to pursue policies that make our economy more productive by identifying the critical value of specific industrial sectors and spurring investment in these sectors. The depletion of American manufacturing has left us with a tremendous national security vulnerability. Now, I am not advocating for a government takeover of our means of production. What I am calling for is us to remember that from the Second World War to the space race and beyond, a capitalist America has always relied on public-private collaboration to further our national security. And from the internet to GPS, many of the innovations that have made America a technological superpower originated from national defense-oriented public-private partnerships. This kind of collaboration is not a rejection of capitalism. It is a call to encourage and harness the dynamism of our economy's most productive private industries to further our national security and ultimately to further our national economic development. Frankly, it is a call for a 21st century pro-American industrial policy. When it comes to Chinese firms, our companies aren't competing with private enterprises. They're competing with a large and powerful nation state. And in the long run, it is a competition that market fundamentalists cannot and will not win. Because China has learned how to leverage access to short-term profits as a way to get many American companies to commit long-term corporate suicide. And because China provides their domestic companies the ability to make investments that make no market sense in the short term, but are critical to their national and economic security in the long term. The market fundamentalists argue that government should not be picking which industries to support, that instead we should unleash the market to make those decisions. But what happens when an industry critical to our national interest is something the market determines is more efficient for China to dominate? The best example of this is rare earth minerals, which are vital to our defense and technology industry. Our country today imports 80% of rare earths from China because the market has determined that importing them is more efficient than investing in our own domestic mining capacity. But what is in our national interest? To adhere to the market's determination and be vulnerable to China, crippling our industries and defenses one day? Or deciding that in this case, the threat to our security makes clear the market is not promoting the common good, and therefore providing government support for increasing our domestic capacity to mine rare earth minerals. But the decision to observe when the market advances the common good shouldn't just be limited to those instances in which its determination runs contrary to national defense. The most controversial argument I've made is that the loss of productive, dignified jobs for Americans represents an existential threat to the common good, especially the jobs that are not easily replaced. It is not in our national interest to have productive and dignified jobs available for young people. Is it not, I would say, in our national interest to have productive and dignified jobs available for young people entering our workforce, for parents who need to support the next generation of Americans? Is it not in our national interest to have that kind of work available for veterans returning to civilian life after serving our country? Is it not in our national interest to ensure that productive new jobs are not only available to Wall Street and Silicon Valley, but to working Americans all across our nation? That's what motivated me as the chairman of the Small Business Committee to overhaul our Small Business Administration. Not because I believe, as some might think, that a revitalized SBA alone is the key to creating these kinds of jobs, but because I believe that federal policies should be directed towards encouraging physical investment into new, dignified work opportunities here in America. I want to ramp up the amount of federal funding for R&D available to small businesses. I want to modernize existing SBA programs so they prioritize encouraging investment in high-potential firms in strategically important industries such as aerospace and rail, electronics, telecommunications, and agricultural machinery. In essence, in the same industries that China is trying to dominate via their Made in China 2025 initiative. This is just a small part of the much broader modernization of our economic policies that we need. Furthermore, we should expand and make permanent the immediate write-off for any business investment in machinery and structures and land, as well as remove bias in our tax code that incentivizes businesses to buy back shares instead of reinvesting profits into their firms and workers. We should continue the current administration's regulatory rollback to achieve a better balance between our nation's economic vitality and common sense protections for our environment and for our public safety. Doing so will provide a viable alternative for American companies considering joint ventures with Chinese firms in order to gain access to capital. It'll help revitalize American manufacturing, which in turn will bring higher wages and stable work opportunities that allow for renewed family and community engagement. We will reestablish a capitalism of the common good. In an essay last month, NDU professor Walter Hudson invoked the words of President Eisenhower, an alumnus and the namesake, of course, of the school. Quote, "Spiritual force multiplied by economic force multiplied by military force is roughly equivalent to security. If any of those factors fell to zero, or nearly so, the resulting product does likewise." End quote. Well, for the United States to be strong in all of these areas and provide for a long-term national prosperity and for a strong national defense and for the dignified work that allows families and communities to thrive and share a sense of purpose, We need to restore our commitment to that kind of common good capitalism. So in conclusion, our current economic policy debate, I believe, offers us an archaic and a false choice. On the left, they want more government programs and more taxes on everything and everyone to pay for them, often advocating incentives and punishments on private industry that stoke identity politics and cultural wars, but that ignore and even undermine our national security and our job creation. The market fundamentalism on the right want more record-setting days in the stock market, and they want it above all else, even if it means our dependence on and losses to China continue expanding to American industries higher and higher up the value chain. It is this financialization of economic policymaking that first allowed China to take over the production of toys and cabinets and mass consumer electronics, and then to take over the production of generic pharmaceuticals. Now they move to take over our genomic therapy industry. To what end? Until it doesn't matter what innovation we come up with, because China will steal it and make it cheaper? Until it doesn't matter how much we spend on research and development, because we need China to manufacture the end result for us? Until every leading technology, communication, transportation, and aerospace leader in the world happens to be a Chinese state-backed firm? If that day should ever come, then we will live in a world in which the most powerful nation on earth will not be the one that believes all people are created equal and born with God-given right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. If that day should ever come, the most powerful nation on earth will be a dictatorship that believes man exists to serve the state, that its citizens' opinions and religion must be cleared by political leaders first, and that the only rights that you have are the rights that those in government allow you to have. What kind of world would that be? What would it mean for Americans here at home? I think we can already see a preview of it in our current events. We see how dozens of Muslim nations defend China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims for fear of losing access to the Chinese market or to Chinese investment. We see how Hollywood already self-censors movies and television shows for fear of not being able to make money in the Chinese market. We see how the most downloaded social media app in the United States, owned by a Chinese firm, banned a young American from the platform because she posted a video drawing attention to mass atrocities in Xinjiang. We saw how, under pressure from China, an hourly employee of Marriott living in Omaha, Nebraska, was fired for liking a Twitter post from a Tibetan group. We see how nations throughout the world, despite knowing for a fact the espionage risk posed by Chinese telecommunication companies, have allowed these companies to take over their domestic deployment of 5G because no non-Chinese cost-effective competitor exists. We see how these same companies are so deeply embedded in our own domestic networks that we still aren't able to remove their equipment from our own military bases. This is just a small preview of the future that awaits us if we do not undertake a complete reorientation of our economic policies. It will not be enough to just ban Chinese technology or condemn Chinese human rights abuses. Achieving a peaceful, sustainable, balanced relationship between the United States and China will require us to increase our national strength by rejuvenating our nation's economic power, by prioritizing and incentivizing private economic activities that give Americans opportunities for dignified work, and by furthering our national development through 21st century American industrial policy compatible and complementary with our system of free enterprise. The stakes, frankly, could not be higher because the outcome will define the 21st century. I thank you for the opportunity to